I don't know exactly when it started. Maybe that's the worst part. There's no clear moment, no distinct line I can point to and say, there, that's where it all went wrong. Instead, it's this slow, creeping realization, this sense that the woman I've been building my life with was slipping away right under my nose. We've been married for 7 years, long enough for comfort to settle in, for routines to take shape. You start to see each other in a certain way, fall into a rhythm that's familiar, even if it's not always exciting. I thought we were solid. Yeah, maybe things had gotten a little stale, but I figured that was just life. I had my job, she had hers, and we moved through the days on autopilot like most couples do after a while. Then she mentioned the girls' trip. It didn't sound suspicious at first. She's taken trips with her friends before, weekends up to the cabin, or wine tours. I wasn't going to begrudge her that. If anything, I was relieved. She seemed excited, almost like her old self again, like the girl I fell in love with. She talked about how they were going to do a spa day, spend a few nights by the beach, drink margaritas, and laugh about the old days. I admit, I felt a little jealous that she was having this kind of fun without me, but I told myself it was healthy. Maybe some time apart would do us both good. The whole thing started to unravel when I dropped her off at the airport. She was smiling, leaning over to kiss me goodbye, her hand warm on my shoulder. But then, as I was about to drive away, I noticed a small duffel bag still in the back seat, the one with her toiletries and swimsuits that she had made such a fuss about packing. I honked, she ran back, and there was this split-second look on her face. It was like panic. Not the, oh no, I forgot my bag kind of panic. Something darker, something like she'd been caught. I almost brushed it off, almost let it go. But that look, it stayed with me. It nagged at me the whole way home. That little flash of fear in her eyes. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems that weren't there. And I probably would have let it drop if it wasn't for a friend texting me that night with a screenshot. Bro, isn't this your wife? It was a post on Instagram from a guy I vaguely recognized. He worked at her company, a younger guy, and one of those obnoxiously handsome sales reps with a smug smile and perfect teeth. The picture was of him in an airport lounge, sunglasses on, a drink in his hand. But in the background, I could see her, my wife, leaning back in a chair, looking at him with this softness, this glow that I hadn't seen in a long time. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. I texted her, trying to keep my voice casual. How's the trip going? She responded quickly, but her words felt forced. Oh, great. Just got to the hotel, about to head out with the girls. I stared at her message for a long time, feeling this numbness creep over me. I knew I should confront her, should call her out right there, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, staring at my phone, feeling like an idiot. I was angry, sure, but beneath that was this overwhelming sadness, this sense of betrayal that I couldn't shake. For the next few days, I went through the motions. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, just waiting for her to come home. I thought about texting her friends, but what was I even going to say? Hey, is my wife actually with you? That felt ridiculous, desperate, like something out of a soap opera. So I waited, simmering in my own frustration. When she finally came back, she acted like nothing had happened. She was smiling, telling me stories about the girls and how they'd all stayed up talking late into the night. But as she spoke, I could feel myself slipping further away from her, like there was this invisible wall between us. I didn't confront her, didn't accuse her. I just nodded, let her talk while something inside me felt like it was breaking. And then, a week later, I ran into her boss. We'd met a few times before, at company functions and the like. She was sharp, confident, always looked me in the eye a little longer than necessary. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed the way she seemed to linger around me at parties. She had that mature, self-assured energy that always drew me in, but I'd never really let myself think about it. That day, though, it was different. After the girls' trip, things between us were off. She came back acting like nothing was wrong, like she'd been on some wholesome getaway, but the trust was gone. I couldn't look at her the same way. Every time she'd laugh or tell me some story from her trip, it just grated on me. I was watching her, trying to catch slips in her stories, tiny contradictions. I was driving myself crazy, replaying every detail, every suspicious moment, trying to fit it all together. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. I knew she hadn't been with her friends, that she'd been with him. That guy from work, with his arrogant smile and stupid designer sunglasses. And the worst part was, she wasn't even hiding it well. I'd see him commenting on her photos, leaving little fire emojis or saying things like, "Wish I was there." She'd always laugh it off, but there was something way too familiar about the way they talked, a kind of casual intimacy that I'd been blind to until now. I felt humiliated. Every time I looked in the mirror, all I saw was a man who'd been played, who'd let this happen right under his nose. She thought she was clever, that I wouldn't catch on, and for weeks I didn't say anything. I just let it eat away at me, going to work, putting on a face, pretending everything was fine when I was seething inside. I'd lie awake at night with her lying right next to me, thinking about her with him, wondering what they'd done, if she'd ever thought about me at all while she was gone. Then one night, I saw her boss again. It was at some company function, a charity event, I think. She dragged me along to be the supportive husband, to wear the nice suit and smile for photos. She was working the room, all charming and professional, and I was just standing by the bar, feeling like the biggest idiot in the world. That's when her boss, Claire, came up to me. Claire's a powerful woman. She's one of those executives who can walk into a room and turn heads without even trying. Tall, poised, with a confidence that borders on intimidating. She's about years older than my wife, but she has this elegance, this calm assurance that pulls you in. She's not the type to waste words, and when she does talk, people listen. She leaned against the bar, ordered a drink, and glanced over at me with this slight smirk. "You don't look like you're having a good time," she said, and there was something knowing in her eyes, like she could see right through me. I started to give her the polite response, to tell her I was fine, but something in me snapped. Just not feeling it tonight, I guess. She looked at me for a moment, her gaze steady and a little too intense. "I get that." She sipped her drink, watching me over the rim of her glass. Sometimes, these events feel like a performance, don't they? Like we're all just pretending to be something we're not. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the weeks of pent-up frustration, but I felt this impulse to confide in her. I barely knew her, but I was desperate to unload, to tell someone what I was going through. And there was something about Claire, something that made me feel like she'd understand, like she wouldn't judge me. "It's funny you say that," I replied, my voice low. "I feel like I've been pretending for a long time now." She raised an eyebrow, studying me. I could feel her probing, like she knew there was more I wasn't saying. After a long silence, she put her hand on my arm, a light touch that sent a shiver through me. "Sometimes," she said softly, "pretending isn't worth it." Her eyes were locked on mine, and for a moment, the world felt smaller, like it was just the two of us in the room. She pulled her hand back, but the warmth of her touch lingered. That night, I went home with my wife, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about Claire, about the way she'd looked at me, the way she seemed to see the pain I was hiding. It felt dangerous, intoxicating. It was the first time in weeks that I felt anything other than anger and hurt. A few days later, I did something I never thought I'd do. I texted Claire. It was a simple message, just a "Hey, it was nice talking to you the other night." I didn't expect much, maybe a polite response, if anything. But almost immediately, she replied. She said she'd been thinking about me too, that she could tell something was bothering me, and if I ever needed to talk, she'd be there. We started messaging back and forth. It was innocent at first, casual, friendly, but there was an undertone, something electric beneath the surface. I told myself it was just nice to have someone to talk to, someone who didn't make me feel like I was crazy. But as the days went on, our messages became more frequent, more personal. She'd ask me how I was feeling, and I'd find myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone else. Then one night, I asked her if she wanted to get away for the weekend. I don't know what possessed me to suggest it. Maybe it was the pent-up resentment, the need to feel wanted, to take back some control in a situation that had made me feel powerless. Maybe it was just the thrill of doing something reckless, something that would hurt my wife the way she'd hurt me. Claire didn't hesitate. She said yes immediately. We planned it quietly, carefully. I didn't tell my wife anything, just packed a small bag and left a vague note about a work conference. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing exactly what she'd done to me. But somehow, that made it feel justified. As I drove to the beach, I kept replaying that moment in the airport, that photo of her with him in the background, the way she'd lied to my face. I told myself that this was fair, that this was balance, that I was just taking back what I'd lost. But beneath that bravado, I felt this gnawing pit of guilt, this whisper telling me that I was making a mistake. And yet, I kept driving. When I got to the beach, Claire's already there. Secluded cabin with a view of the ocean, a far cry from the type of place my wife and I would have ever stayed. It was one of those old-fashioned beach cottages, the kind with creaky wooden floors and a cozy little fireplace. As I walked up, I saw her standing on the porch, looking out at the water, and for a second, I actually hesitated. But then she turned and smiled, this warm, knowing smile that felt like it reached right inside me and squeezed. And just like that, my doubts melted away. I felt lighter, even a little reckless. After weeks of feeling humiliated, of questioning everything, there was this rush of adrenaline, like I was finally doing something for me. Something that made me feel alive. She didn't ask a lot of questions when I got there. She just poured me a glass of wine, gestured for me to sit on the deck with her, and we watched the sunset in silence. I appreciated that about Claire. She wasn't crying, didn't push me to spill my guts or explain myself. She seemed to understand that I needed to just be, to escape without having to justify anything. After a while, she started talking about work, about her life, about her ex-husband who'd cheated on her years ago. She said it casually, like she'd moved past it, but there was an edge in her voice that told me the wound had never fully healed. We bonded over that, over this shared feeling of betrayal, of realizing that people you trust can be capable of things you never imagined. It was comforting in a twisted way, like finding someone who understood the exact type of pain I was carrying. Eventually, she reached out and touched my hand. I didn't pull away. Her touch was gentle, and before I knew it, she'd leaned in, her face close to mine, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. I felt a pang of guilt, this flicker of something telling me to stop, but then I thought of my wife, of her lying to my face, and that pang faded. I kissed her. It was slow, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, became something more intense, more consuming. I lost myself in it, in the warmth of her touch, the way she seemed to want me, in a way I hadn't felt wanted in a long time. We didn't say a word as we moved inside, to the couch, to the bed. It was like I'd been starving for this kind of connection, this kind of release. I woke up the next morning tangled in the sheets, with Claire lying next to me, her breathing slow and even. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, reality settling in like a weight on my chest. The thrill from the night before had dulled, replaced by a complicated mixture of satisfaction and shame. I didn't regret it, not exactly, but I knew that this was a line I couldn't uncross, that no matter how justified I'd felt the night before, I was a different person now. I'd crossed over into territory I'd always sworn I wouldn't. Claire woke up a little while later, and we shared this small, awkward smile. I could tell she was feeling it too, that strange mix of pleasure and guilt. We didn't talk about it, didn't try to define what had happened. We just got dressed, made coffee, and went for a walk on the beach, acting like any other couple on a weekend getaway. But the air between us felt heavier now, loaded with the weight of what we'd done. At one point, she reached for my hand, and I let her hold it, but my mind kept drifting back to my wife. I wondered if she'd ever find out, if she'd feel even a fraction of the betrayal that I'd felt. Part of me wanted her to know, to feel that sting, that humiliation. But another part of me felt sick at the thought. No matter how much I wanted revenge, there was still a part of me that didn't want to hurt her, at least not like this. We spent the day exploring the little beach town, walking along the shore, grabbing lunch at a local cafe. For a few hours, I managed to push everything else out of my mind and just enjoy the simplicity of it, the feeling of being with someone who seemed to actually see me, to appreciate me. Claire was easy to talk to, and I found myself opening up to her in ways that I hadn't with my wife in years. I told her things I hadn't even realized I'd been holding in, the frustrations, the loneliness, the feeling that I'd been taken for granted. She listened without judgment, her hand resting lightly on my arm, her eyes locked on mine. I could tell she was genuinely interested, that she actually cared, and for a moment, I let myself believe that this could be more than just revenge, that maybe this was the start of something real. But as night fell, reality crept back in. I started checking my phone, wondering if my wife had noticed my absence if she tried to call or text. There was nothing, just silence. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. It was like she didn't even care that I was gone. When I told Claire I needed to head back the next day, she didn't seem surprised. She just nodded, a sad little smile on her face, like she knew this was never going to be more than a temporary escape. We spent one last night together, and this time it was slower, softer, with an unspoken understanding that this was the end. The next morning, as I packed my bag and got ready to leave, she walked me out to the car. We stood there for a long moment, not quite looking at each other, both of us unsure of what to say. Finally, she reached out and hugged me, a long, lingering embrace that felt heavier than any words we could have said. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, and there was a sadness in her voice that made my chest tighten. "You too," I replied, feeling like a complete asshole. She'd let me in, given me a part of herself, and here I was walking away, going back to the life I'd temporarily escaped from. The drive home was a blur. My mind was racing, cycling through guilt, satisfaction, anger, and regret. I kept telling myself that what I'd done was justified, that my wife had betrayed me first, but it was a hollow kind of comfort. I felt like I'd lost something in that weekend, some part of myself that I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. When I finally walked through the door of my house, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The silence was suffocating, like the walls themselves were judging me. My wife was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and she looked up with a casual, "Hey," as if I'd just come back from a regular day at work. I stood there, staring at her, feeling this tidal wave of emotions that I couldn't begin to sort through. She didn't know. She had no idea where I'd been, what I'd done, and maybe she never would. But as I looked at her, I realized something even harder to swallow. I had no idea if I even cared anymore. After that weekend, I thought things might somehow feel clearer. I thought maybe I'd come back with some kind of direction, a sense of closure, or even satisfaction. But if anything, I felt more conflicted than ever. I'd expected guilt, but I didn't expect the hollowness, the way the high from that weekend faded so quickly. I came home to a wife who didn't seem to notice I'd been gone, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. Maybe she really didn't care anymore. Or maybe she was just pretending the same way I was. Days went by, and neither of us brought it up. She didn't ask me where I'd been, didn't question the sudden work trip I'd supposedly gone on. If she was suspicious, she didn't show it. And somehow, that felt worse than any confrontation could have. I wanted her to care, to demand answers, to accuse me. Instead, we drifted around each other in this uncomfortable silence, each of us carrying secrets we weren't willing to admit. But that silence, it was suffocating. It was like a wall had gone up between us, thicker and higher than ever before. I'd catch myself studying her, looking for signs, trying to figure out if she'd really been with him on that girl's trip, if she felt even a hint of remorse for what she'd done. But she was unreadable, almost disturbingly calm. And the less she reacted, the angrier I got. One night, we were lying in bed, backs turned to each other, the space between us feeling like miles. I couldn't take it anymore. I rolled over, my voice coming out rough and tense. "So, how was that girl's trip?" I asked, my tone barely hiding the accusation. She stiffened. I could feel it in the way her body tensed under the sheets. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just lay there, as if hoping I'd drop it. But I wasn't backing down. "It was fine," she finally replied, her voice guarded. "Why are you asking?" "Just curious. Didn't see any photos of you with your friends. Just one with someone else." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I knew I was slipping, the bitterness seeping through. She turned to face me then, her eyes narrowing. "Were you spying on me?" "Spying? Are you serious?" I snapped. "You're acting like I'm the one who did something wrong here." She sat up, folding her arms defensively. "And what exactly are you accusing me of?" "I don't know," I shot back, my voice rising. "Maybe of lying. Maybe of cheating. You know, the things that are apparently just normal now in this marriage." Her face went pale, and for a second, I thought I'd finally broken through, that maybe she'd confess, that we'd finally get to the truth. But then she just shook her head, this cold, almost pitying look in her eyes. "You really think that low of me, don't you?" she said quietly, her voice almost sad. "You really think I would do that to you? Wouldn't you?" I challenged, hating the desperation in my own voice. "I saw that photo, all right? I know you weren't with your friends the whole time. Just be honest with me. For once." She looked away, her jaw clenching. I could tell she was choosing her words carefully, weighing what to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice so controlled it was almost eerie. "You're right. I wasn't with my friends the whole time. I ran into someone from work. We had drinks, but nothing happened, all right? Not that I expect you to believe me." Her answer was so clinical, like she was reading from a script. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to believe her, but there was another part, the part that had seen her laughing in that airport photo, looking at him like he was the only person in the world, that just couldn't let it go. "So what?" I said, my voice bitter. "You just expect me to believe you." She sighed, lying back down and turning away from me. "Believe what you want. I don't have to explain myself to someone who obviously doesn't trust me." That was it. That was her defense. A vague half-admission, a refusal to engage, like I was the one who was overreacting. And the worst part, I realized in that moment that she probably wasn't lying. I realized that she didn't care enough to lie. Whatever I accused her of, whatever truth I thought I was uncovering, it didn't matter to her. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling more lost than ever. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was she telling the truth? Was she lying? Did it even matter at this point? I felt like we both crossed lines that we couldn't come back from. That even if she hadn't cheated, even if it was just drinks or a fling with no strings attached, we were already broken. And maybe we'd been broken for a long time. Over the next few days, I kept going through the motions, trying to act normal, but inside I was unraveling. I kept thinking about Claire, replaying that weekend in my head, wondering if I should tell my wife, if I should confess everything. Part of me wanted to, just to get a reaction, to make her feel even a fraction of the hurt I was carrying. But another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. She'd just look at me with that same empty expression, that mask of indifference, and I'd be left feeling even more foolish than before. Then one evening, my wife got a call from work. She was sitting at the kitchen table, talking in that polite, businesslike tone she always used. I didn't think much of it, just half listened as I cooked dinner. But then I heard her say Claire's name. My stomach dropped. I could feel my hands start to shake as I chopped vegetables, straining to hear what she was saying. She kept her tone calm, but there was a tension there, something off. I caught bits and pieces. Words like inappropriate and boundaries in HR. It was enough to send a chill down my spine. When she hung up, she looked over at me, her face pale. I forced myself to stay casual, even though my heart was racing. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. "Just work drama. Claire's getting some heat for something inappropriate with an employee." She said it carefully, like she was choosing her words. I felt my throat go dry, and I turned away, pretending to focus on the food. I could feel her watching me, like she was trying to read my reaction. "That's rough," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't say anything, just kept looking at me with this strange expression, like she was putting pieces together in her head. I felt exposed, like she could see right through me, like she knew everything without me saying a word. But she didn't ask. She just nodded slowly, her eyes unreadable. That night, we didn't talk about it. But the silence between us was different now. Heavier, charged, like we were both standing on opposite sides of a fault line, waiting for the ground to split open. I went to bed feeling sick, replaying that conversation, wondering if Claire had said something, if my wife was starting to suspect. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd done what I needed to do, that I'd just been leveling the playing field. But lying there in the dark, I realized that whatever revenge I'd thought I'd gotten, whatever satisfaction I'd hoped for, it wasn't there. All I'd done was add another layer to the mess. I wasn't any closer to the truth. I was just lost. And the worst part was, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to find my way back. Days passed after that phone call, but the weight of what was left unsaid hung over us like a storm cloud ready to burst. We moved around each other in silence, going through the motions of our lives. But the air was thick with suspicion, resentment, and something else, an unspoken acknowledgement that we'd both crossed a line, whether she knew the specifics or not. I kept waiting for her to confront me, to demand the truth, but she didn't. And that silence. It was worse than any fight. I was constantly on edge, replaying everything in my head. The weekend with Claire, my wife's so-called girls' trip, the late nights of lying awake next to her, knowing that we were both hiding things, both pretending to be people we weren't anymore. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I'd become someone I barely recognized, a man who'd lied and cheated, who'd taken petty revenge without a second thought. And Claire, the woman I'd seen as my escape, my way of taking back control. She was nowhere to be found. After that HR call, she'd stopped replying to my texts, and part of me wondered if she'd gone to HR herself, if maybe she'd been trying to save herself from the fallout of what we'd done. I felt abandoned, discarded, like I'd been nothing more than a fleeting distraction for her, just like she'd been for me. But I couldn't dwell on that. I had bigger problems. One evening, I got home late, finding my wife in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine. She was sitting at the table, looking down at her phone, and for a moment, I thought about just turning around, avoiding her altogether. But something in her expression stopped me. This strange mix of anger and sadness that I hadn't seen before. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes meeting mine, and I knew immediately that something had changed. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but cold. I swallowed, feeling my pulse quicken. "All right." She gestured to the chair across from her, and I sat down, my hands fidgeting in my lap. There was a long, painful silence as she looked at me, like she was trying to gather her thoughts, to decide how much to say. Finally, she sighed, setting her phone down on the table between us. "I know," she said softly, her voice laced with exhaustion. "I know about you and Claire." The blood drained from my face. I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it or explain it away, but no words came. I just sat there, frozen, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she was holding back tears, and it gutted me. How did you find out?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Does it matter? You think I'm an idiot? You think I didn't notice you sneaking off, making excuses, acting like you were suddenly too busy for this marriage?" Her voice was rising, the anger breaking through. "You think I didn't notice you checking your phone every 5 minutes, acting distracted? I'm not blind." I felt a surge of shame, a painful twist in my chest. I'd underestimated her, dismissed her, and now here she was laying it all out in front of me, showing me just how wrong I'd been. But before I could respond, she kept going. I kept telling myself it was in my head," she said, her voice wavering. "That maybe I was just being paranoid, that maybe we were just going through a rough patch. But then I found the messages. On your computer. I saw everything." I looked down, unable to meet her gaze, feeling the full weight of my betrayal. She'd read the messages. The ones with Claire. Every flirty line, every confession, every plan for that weekend away. My stomach twisted, and I felt like I might be sick. She leaned forward, her voice cold and sharp. "How long has it been going on?" I shook my head, trying to find words to make sense of everything. "It was just that weekend. It didn't mean anything." "Oh, it didn't mean anything," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So that's supposed to make me feel better. That you threw away our marriage for someone who didn't mean anything." I had no defense. She was right. I destroyed something we'd built for years. And for what? For revenge. For some petty attempt to hurt her the way I thought she'd hurt me. It all felt so hollow now, so pointlessly destructive. But then she surprised me. She sat back, crossing her arms, and took a long, shaky breath. I almost did the same thing. Her words hit me like a slap. I looked up, confusion and shock written across my face. She met my gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That girls' trip?" "Yeah, I was with him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But nothing happened. I was tempted. God, was I tempted? but I couldn't go through with it. I thought about you. I thought about us, and I told myself that this marriage still meant something. My throat went dry, and I felt a strange, bitter mix of relief and regret. She'd been honest, and she'd come back, choosing me even when I hadn't chosen her. She'd given me the benefit of the doubt, and I'd repaid her by breaking the last fragile thread that held us together. We sat there in silence, both of us staring at each other, both raw and exposed. Our sins laid bare on the table between us. I could feel the weight of everything we'd done, every betrayal, every lie, pressing down on us like a crushing weight. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I was sorry, that I'd made a terrible mistake. But I didn't know if words would be enough. I didn't know if we could come back from this. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but resigned. I think we both know this isn't working anymore. I nodded, feeling my chest tighten. Yeah, I think you're right. There it was. The truth we'd been avoiding. The decision we'd been circling for months. I wanted to argue, to fight for something, but I didn't even know what I was fighting for anymore. We'd hurt each other too deeply, crossed too many lines. Whatever love we'd once had was buried under layers of bitterness, betrayal, and resentment. Looking down at me one last time, I'm going to stay with my sister for a while. I think we both need space. Time to figure out what we want. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I watched her walk away, heard the quiet click of the front door closing behind her, and just like that, I was alone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty wine glass she'd left on the table. The silence of the house pressing in on me. I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even freedom, but all I felt was loss. The life we'd built together, the future I'd taken for granted, it was all gone, shattered by our mutual betrayals, our inability to be honest with each other until it was too late. As I sat there, I thought about the choices we'd both made, the moments we could have turned back, could have chosen each other instead of our own egos, our own need for revenge. And I realized with a painful clarity that this was the real cost of betrayal. Not just losing each other, but losing the parts of ourselves that had once made us believe in forever. And as the silence settled around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that in trying to hurt her, I'd only ended up hurting myself.